President Cyril Ramaphosa has hosted His Majesty King Mswati III of the Kingdom of Eswatini for a working visit at Mahlabandlovu, the President's official residence in Pretoria. Now, this visit follows a courtesy visit by President Ramaphosa to His Majesty King Mswati III in Lozita, Eswatini on earlier this month. South Africa and Eswatini share strong historical bonds as well as mutually beneficial political and trade ties. Mbulle-Nziege Leonard, who's a senior consultant at Concerto, which is a global public affairs management firm, joins us now to expand on this. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. What would you say is the purpose for such a visit?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on air. Like you said, South Africa and the Kingdom of Eswatini have very, very strong relations, both across the political, economic, as well as cultural spectrum. So I think this was just a continuation or a confirmation of these fraternal ties. And, you know, this is expressed at the highest level, wherein not only do you have the South African head of state and the monarch of Eswatini meeting together, but you also have regular interministerial meetings between the leaders of these two countries.
We know that South Africa and Eswatini share strong historical bonds. How far would you say that the two countries' mutually beneficial political and trade ties go insofar as economic relations are concerned?
Well, economically, there is obviously a big disparity. South Africa is not only the largest and most developed economy in the SADC region, but also in Africa. There is also a significant disparity with respect to, you know, the companies which invest in the respective countries. South African firms are very, very active across all the major sectors of the Eswatini economy, be it agriculture, be it telecoms, finance, and so on and so forth. Don't necessarily, it's not necessarily reciprocated by Eswatini entities. But nevertheless, it is still a fruitful relationship, which is mutually beneficial, although, well, not mutually beneficial, but beneficial, however, more to the advantage of South Africa.
And with that in mind, how then would you contextualize the relationship between the two countries and perhaps the extent of influence? I mean, for one, there are serious inequalities when it comes to upholding human rights in Eswatini, as opposed to South Africa claiming to be a human rights-based democracy.
Yes, and you have to understand, Eswatini is the only absolute monarch in Africa. However, South Africa has an advantageous position in order to, you know, interact with the Eswatini government in order to ensure that there is progress made with respect to, you know, promoting democratic rights, civil liberties, and other associated political rights. Because the past couple of years, there has been, you know, a growing desire for Eswatini citizens to be able to express their political rights similar to what is seen in South Africa. And because of the strong relations, as I said, across the board, be it politically, economically, culturally, as well as South Africa's, image and status as one of the foremost democracies, not only in Africa, but across the global South, they're in a better position to be able to put pressure, well, not necessarily pressure, but at least speak on better terms with the Eswatini authorities to pursue improvements with respect to, you know, improving their democracy, as well as ensuring that the citizens of Eswatini experience better civil liberties.
Yeah. As you talk about some of the strides that will be made with the gathering and the conversations that come out of the two presidents, the two leaders, do you think at all that there could be some headway when it comes to the AKA murder, for instance, some of the suspects that need to be extradited from Eswatini? Could such a conversation and such a platform yield some results in that process where justice will need to be served?
Well, as you know, the crime agenda tackling crime has been top of the president's agenda, although that hasn't necessarily, you know, reflected on the ground, where we've had high-profile murders such as, you know, AKA. And as we know, two of the suspected individuals involved in the case are currently being held in Eswatini. We also know President Ramaphosa as an individual who respects the rule of law, but nevertheless, he could potentially use that avenue to speak to the Eswatini monarch to facilitate things in order to ensure that the individuals concerned are sent back to South Africa in order to face justice. Because, as he noted in several instances, AKO is one of the foremost young South Africans, an individual who, not only in the cultural level, but also just, as a beacon of, promoting South African talents, was missed by the South African public. So I think the president could potentially reach out in that regard, or could instruct one of the ministers to interact with Eswatini authorities in that regard.
On another take, I mean, look at the matter around the editor of Swaziland News, Zweli Martin Dlamini, who's insisting that the Eswatini government's court application to extradite him to face several charges in a ruse of to kidnap and send him back to Mbambane. He's alleging that the Eswatini regime is fighting him merely for being the voice of the voiceless and defending and demanding transparency and accountability in the public administration. Eswatini is a country where the media is heavily controlled by the state. I mean, over the years, there's been an increase in political killings there, and the killings are alleged to be driven by the state to quell pro-democracy voices in that country. How far could that conversation go around the human rights matter and press freedom, with the two leaders coming together, and hopefully some influence from President Ramaphosa to King Mswati III?
Well, there could be potentially some progress. However, what we've realized with respect to how South Africa engages with respect to other countries which are transgressing, or which have been accused of transgressing with respect to not respecting democratic as well as civil liberties, preventing the freedom of expression and speech, South African government usually acts through the regional body, which is SADC. We've seen it previously with respect to Eswatini, wherein SADC delegations have been deployed to speak to the Eswatini government about, alleged abuses against, people as well as entities which have been criticizing the government. We've seen it as well with respect to Zimbabwe, where SADC missions have been deployed, but then in many instances, South Africa has been able to use its positionality as the leading political force, as the most stable democracy, to, lobby for these delegations to be sent, whereby engagements can be taken. Because another thing is that it's very rare for the South African government as well as South African ministers to openly criticize the activities which are happening in other countries. So I think it is something that, the president will bring up if it's mentioned with respect to, how civil society actors have, pleaded the case about it. But then directly at a bilateral level, I think it'd be unlikely that any sort of pressure will be put, and rather, the overtures would be pursued at a regional level.
And very lastly, we know that after this diplomatic engagement with King Mswati III, Ramaphosa is expected to go to East Africa, starting off with the Republic of Uganda. What purpose will such a visit serve?
Yes, with respect to Uganda, South Africa and Uganda have quite good relations. President Museveni, who's one of Africa's longest standing leaders, he's been in power since 1986. He was in South Africa last year for a state visit in February, and the aim is to build on these fraternal ties. I think a main domain where there's going to be discussions is trade. Uganda and South Africa have bilateral trade which stands at $130 million per year. But nevertheless, I think South Africa, because South Africa has the majority of its trade with respect to other African countries, South Africa would like to improve on that. South African companies invest across the domain in Uganda in telecoms, finance, agriculture, trade, and retail. So South Africa and President Ramaphosa's visit will try to build on that, and also security. As you know, in the Great Lakes region, wherein Uganda is located, there is a rebel movement, the M23 movement, which has been carrying out attacks in eastern DRC. SADC troops, which includes the South African contingent, are deployed there. And President Museveni is a very strong stakeholder within the East African political and security ecosystem. Therefore, I believe that there will be discussions in that regard, because in the past, Uganda has been accused of backing the M23 rebel group. This time around, they're not, but then nevertheless, the country has also been a major stakeholder. So I think the president is also going to allude to that during his visit to the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Mbulle-Nziege Leonard, who's a senior consultant at Concerto, which is a global public affairs management firm, of course, giving us some depth and detail around the working visit of the King Mswati III, as well as President Cyril Ramaphosa heading to Uganda thereafter.